After the QIND process and lockup is complete, will outstanding shares of Ilus be converted to a percentage of shares of QIND in an effort to tidy up the float and further reduce the outstanding share count?
All right. So if I understand you correctly, let me just. So QIND is a public company, right? So obviously, Ilus shareholders can't get QIND shares unless they buy them, if I understand you correctly. So I hope that's clear because
Um,
it's a public company.
well, sort of. If someone were to lock up their shares, would they be getting like if I'm sort of like prying into the lockup plans? I'm trying to get in your mind a little bit about that. If somebody were to lock up, say, 1,000 Isla shares, would they get a percentage of QIND or a subsidiary share towards the shares that they locked up? And would that, and I'm going to get into this in the next question, would that affect other subsidiaries as well?
Yeah, so not per se in QIND because QIND is a public company. ERT is different. ERT is a private company operating under the Ilus umbrella. But let me talk about the lockup quickly then. So those who lock up their shares, this is what we're working on, would get a consideration in terms of a percentage of shares that they've locked up in the form of Ilus shares, right? So that's typically how it would work. And that's typically how share lockups would work. So an example would be that if someone locks up 1,000 shares, they would get back 1,100 shares as an example after the lockup period. Again, that's just one example, right? So it could be more, it could be less. In terms of the final options for shareholders. But because QIND is public, it's not as straightforward as you've said it, right? So I hope people that will understand that are not, kind of hear what I'm not saying. There is certainly a consideration that they would get in the form of Ilus shares, right? So, and then that should result in a reduction of the OS if it's taken up well. And that's why we've tried to time it at the opportune time so that it's taken up well, right? I think and obviously doing it in conjunction with a subsidiary uplist is important. That's not to say that ERT, for example, wouldn't uplist then fairly soon after or in a time period. Again, I don't want to get back into the likes of timelines, but at that point, then shareholders could benefit in ERT again because it's private, right? So hopefully that clarifies, and you can look that up and things like
Yeah.
that if um
It sort of does. I know there's a lot of people that are thinking in more of simple math, I guess you could say, where they think, and I know I came from this mindset where if I were to lock up 1,000 Isla shares or a percentage of Isla shares based on whatever, then I would get X amount of QIND shares if that was included in the lockup, and I would get X amount. And this is sort of merging into the next question. I would
yeah
get shares of ERT or I get shares of Hyperion. I think that's where a lot of the people want details on basically how is this lockup going to work and how can we obtain shares of the subsidiaries through ILS value, or are we going to get shares? I mean, I guess I don't want to say dumb it down, but if we could just get it to a point where people understand, okay, this is sort of how it's going to work.
yeah
If
I
that makes
understand
sense,
that.
yeah,
Isla shareholders want to understand what really is in it for them should they lock up their shares and things like that. So I certainly get it. It's a great question, really. I just wanted to clarify regarding ERT and QIND because it's just
yep,
a difference between the two, right? If it was possible to do it in QIND, and maybe there's a way that I'm not aware of, and forgive me if I am wrong in that respect. But in my understanding is that with it being a public company, it's not possible in the way that you've asked the question. However, with ERT, it is possible. So again, if anything is possible and it benefits shareholders, we will always look to do it. I think that needs to be clear. Um, Again, if ILIS remains on the OTC or HCQB, you would expect that when QIND uplists, ILIS shareholders will benefit as technically that share price should increase. Of course, I can't guarantee that it would. I'm just saying that the ILIS balance sheet and the valuation should increase substantially in the uplist of QIND, right? So shareholders should benefit in that respect. But QIND is public, ERT itself is not, so it would either follow the same SPV route as QIND, or it would spin out to a big board, for example, in the form of an IPO, right? And in the event of the latter, ILIS shareholders would potentially get or ILIS shareholders that have locked their shares up, potentially even just ILIS shareholders would get a consideration in terms of shares in ERT. Is
okay, all
that a
right,
bit more clear?
yeah, absolutely,
And just
all
to
right.
say, that was actually the original plan, right? We spoke about multiple subsidiary uplists. Then we brought in the SPV in the form of QIND. Why? Because we didn't want to keep adding to the Ilus uh, OS, right?
Mm-hmm.
To the outstanding shares. It's really one of the main reasons. We wanted to seek ways of funding large acquisitions without affecting the Ilus outstanding shares, the share structure. And we know that that's very, very important to
Mm-hmm.
shareholders. Of course, it's impossible to expect a company never to increase the SS, right? A
Mm-hmm.
company at least that is doing acquisitions, that is growing, and that has the financials to prove that growth, right? If a company is just kind of sitting around and it's got a huge board and it's not really doing, it's talking about doing this and doing this merge and doing that, and its SS is increasing, then its OS is increasing, then rightly, I think shareholders should be pointing fingers. I would certainly be right there with you, right, saying that's wrong. You shouldn't be doing it. You guys are clearly just in this for yourselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we obviously continue to grow the business. We continue to acquire more companies. We continue to grow operation and things like that. So again, I just think
Mm-hmm.
shareholders should be realistic in that respect.
Okay. Yeah, and I want to just clarify that because some people were confused. What QIND, like you guys own the majority of that, so those the benefits, the revenues can get reported directly to the ILS books. So that is correct.
Yeah.
All
So
right.
we
All right.
consolidate QIND's revenues into the ILS books. Yes.
Bingo. All right.
Because,
So that clears up a lot too. So and when you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars and you're talking about ILS still, I'm gonna say sitting at 4 cents in the OTC, that is substantial. All right. So, and
yeah.
there aren't companies that are doing that. So and you guys, your footprint is wide and far. So that's
Yeah.
great. Let's
Yeah,
I'm gonna just
just to sorry to interrupt you. Just to
yeah,
say, QIND's assets, for example, I think at the moment is $152 million. I must stand to be corrected slightly there.
yeah.
So that, for example, is consolidated by ILIS, and that will continue as QIND grows. So it will continue to reflect in the ILIS books.